This is Duke University.
Good morning. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of the alumni, both from Fuqua and Duke University, to this session this morning. Thank you very much for taking the time to participate. We are sitting here in the American Underground in Durham, which is a space for startups and various organizations that support them. And we're in particularly the space occupied by the Triangle Startup Factory, which is an incubator here in Durham, and we'd like to thank Dave Neal and Chris Hively very much for hosting us here. My name is John Fjeld. I'm in the strategy area at Fuqua, and I head up the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. My primary teaching is in entrepreneurship, and I hope I have a number of former students in the session this morning. So the format this morning will be very casual, very informal. Let me make sure I get it straight. If you have any questions or comments, you can submit them by tweeting using hashtag Fuqua alumni, and I guess you can email them. Yes? Okay. We have a couple of questions that were sent in advance, and I'll take those up in just a second. I hope very much you've had a chance to take a look at the brief video. Basically, what I tried to do was summarize and reflect on some of the experience we've had working with various startup ideas over the last 7-8 years at Fuqua. And in particular, I wanted to talk a bit about questions that I've had from a number of students and alumni about the right balance of planning and execution in a startup. And this gave me an opportunity to reflect a little bit on the lean startup model and how that applies. So let me take a couple of the questions first. I'd like to thank Chris Thompson, who's daytime 08. And I'll just read his comment. Just one quick suggestion, nitpicking. We shouldn't call lean new. It makes us look behind if we consider it new. And Chris, thank you very much for that comment. And I guess the thought behind my referring to it as new is we've had probably a couple of thousand years of entrepreneurship in the world, and the lean startup idea has been around for 6, 7, 8 years. So I guess in the broad sense of things, it's relatively new. But possibly more importantly, and perhaps this is what was on your mind, the lean startup is in fact not new concepts. It is new packaging and outstanding marketing, but for some of you that have taken one of my entrepreneurship classes may have remembered the Estee Lauder case. And Estee Lauder, working in the 20s and 30s, exemplified probably more than any entrepreneur I can think of the spirit and the principles of the lean startup. So the ideas are not new, but I think that Steve Blank and the crew have done an outstanding job of packaging and marketing that concept. The second question that we have is from Randy Bollinger, who is a Wemba 97. And I'll just read this comment. When I was at Fuqua 16 years ago, the reason most new businesses failed was purported to be inadequate capitalization. Are the capital requirements for a lean startup different from those of a traditional one? And how do you estimate the amount of money one needs for a quick and lean startup? This is a really interesting and important question. And I think it kind of gets to the heart of this issue of the balance between planning and execution in a startup. If you are right about everything, then it doesn't matter whether you develop a full business plan, fund it, and get going. One of the key ideas behind the lean startup, and in fact good practice in entrepreneurship, is recognizing that you're probably not right about important things. That is, you're probably wrong about some of the important assumptions that underlie your startup. So the question of how do you execute, especially in the early stages, is really about, as I tried to illustrate a little bit in the video, was how do you learn efficiently? How do you apply capital in the most efficient way to uncover the important mistakes early in the process so that you actually can live long enough to execute on the right idea? So if you apply, I think, good planning in a startup, you'll think about how to use your capital as efficiently as possible, how to learn quickly so that you waste as little capital as possible. So in a sense, the lean startup methodology, the right discipline in entrepreneurship in general, is about using capital efficiently, and it should be the least amount of capital to get from your original mistaken idea to a good idea that you can go execute on. So those are two questions. Anything else yet? So I know that there are a number of you out there. I would be very interested in any comments or any questions that you have. And you know, while we're waiting for more questions, I'll make one additional comment about Randy's question. You may recall that I said in the presentation that there are four basic keys to success in a startup. A good idea, good execution, money, and luck. It's a bit, you can't succeed without all four of those ingredients, and so it becomes a little difficult to say which is most important. But my experience, as I said in that video, is the most common source of failure is not really finding a market need up front. If you've identified a real market need and can prove it, if you will, you can generally find some way to get the startup off the ground. Money is hard, but if you really have a good, solid market need, I think that the capital can usually be found. Should comment that you know, those of you that saw the video will have seen Evan McCormick, who was one of our stellar graduates of the program. He's one of the Fuqua alums who is now occupying space in the American Underground and benefiting from the services of the Triangle Startup Factory. Oh, hang on just a second. Wonderful. Thank you. Here's an anonymous question. Is it better to start a company as an individual or a group? Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to put this in the context of who are entrepreneurs, and is there a special kind of person who is an entrepreneur? And I always answer that question by saying, really, most people have the capability to be part of an entrepreneurial team. It's almost impossible to succeed on your own. And I always deflect the question of who is the right entrepreneur to what are the characteristics of the right founding team. So, and a founding team has to have a set of complementary skills. Again, it's very difficult for one person to embody all of those things. So I would say in almost all cases, if you're interested in starting a company, you should try to be as frank with yourself as possible about your skills, your strengths, and your weaknesses, and try to find co-founders who can complement the let's call them shortcomings that you might have. It's very, very difficult to do this by yourself. So I would say always better to start as a group. Jeff Angtuako, I really hope I didn't butcher that name. Daytime 07, thank you very much for your question. Does Fuqua or Duke have an incubator or provide help for alums? So the first step, if you're an alum and if you're watching, I very much hope that you're part of the Duke Gen network. You can just go to dukegen.com and sign up, and this is a growing community now, more than 4,000 alums strong, who have provided excellent support to each other, excellent help for each other. We have angel pitch events in New York and in San Francisco every year, where entrepreneurs have pitched to Duke interested angel investors, some of whom have got funding. So what we have done is tried to provide support for alumni first through building a community and building a network, and the core is Duke Gen. And then I think that in the presentation I referred to some of the online resources, and I might point you to Duke Venn, that's V as in victory, E-N, dukevenn.com, where I and a couple of others have tried to summarize some of the principles of starting a company. And generally, many of us at Fuqua and at Duke have engaged with alumni and tried to help them along the way. What advice do you have on time management for entrepreneurs? So here's one of the tricks to being a successful entrepreneur. It's very easy to work 20 hours a day, feel that you're very busy, you've always got too much to do, and yet you're not really making any progress. One of the tricks to being a successful entrepreneur is focus on doing what's most important to move the business forward. This ties very much to the point of the presentation, which is building a roadmap from where you are to at least some number of steps closer to success in your startup. Identify the primary risks, the primary unknowns that you have to resolve, and focus on answering those questions, and avoid getting distracted by things that aren't really important now. As an example, I see very often technology-oriented entrepreneurs spending a huge amount of time worrying about product architecture, product design, when they don't know really what problem they're solving. Again, this, I think Steve Blank expresses this well, but this is really the principle that underlies everything we do in the program for entrepreneurs. Go make sure you understand the customers whose problems you're solving. Cobble together some way to test your ideas before you try to architect the perfect product. So again, time management, very important. The critical thing is to stay focused on things that really matter and avoid doing things that are really of secondary importance. Rick Sissel or Kissel, Daytime 95. Please share your thoughts on the role passion and purpose play in building a sustainable organization or a sustaining organization for an entrepreneur. Rick, thank you very much for that question. I have to confess I must be getting old because the way I express things isn't always the way our students think about things. The word passion to me is possibly overused today. but that could just be me being a little out of step. So let me start with purpose. It's very hard to sustain the work required to build a company, to build an organization, if you're not working on something that you believe is fundamentally important and fundamentally worth doing. Part of what it takes to be successful is not only to commit yourself 100%, your time, your energy, but it's to attract other people and get that same level of commitment from them. The only way I've seen that work is when there is a purpose that that everybody believes in, that everybody commits to, and if passion is the right word to describe that feeling of commitment, that feeling that you're working for something bigger than your own personal interests, then I think that's critical. As I said, it's when it gets really tough, the thing that sustains you is that you're doing something you believe is truly worthwhile. David Stevens, stayed time 94. What approaches or methods do you recommend for to accelerate the learning process? I've thought a little bit about this, and let me just step back for a second before I address that question. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about the lean startup, not just how because it's captured the attention of both entrepreneurs and, in a surprising way, corporate America right now. I think of what those guys have tried to do is to take the discipline of entrepreneurship and at some level turn it into a bit of a recipe. There's a canvas, there's a set of steps, go do this, and that's the path to success. My approach has always been a little different, which is certainly as I've worked with students to try to help them understand the underlying logic of what they're doing in a way that can let them apply it to the broadest set of possible circumstances. And if you do go to Duke Venn, what you'll see is more an approach that tries to really articulate the logic that underlies starting a business. So how do you accelerate the learning process? Fundamentally, the principle is that you have to figure out what the keys are to success. Put differently, what are the biggest risks or the reasons the business might fail? And then go through a process of thinking about the severity of the risks and the probability of those risks, coupled with the cost of resolving the uncertainty, and come up with this roadmap as I've described. Once I've said that, so based on what do you decide severity of risk, probability, etc.? There's no better guide than experience. And if you don't think that you've had enough experience, what you need to do is reach out to a set of people and be as open with as many people from different backgrounds with different experience sets so you can bring in as much information as early as possible and add as much experience to the process as you can. And if it's not your own, that's fine. That's why I always advise companies as they're starting, go find people who've had experience doing something similar or had experience in the industry you're in or with the customer set you're working with, and see if you can attract them as advisors. People are generally excited if you have an idea that's worth working on, if you have a purpose that's worth pursuing, and you can leverage the experience of others. And the more help you get, the quicker your learning process will be. And thank you for that question. Shannon Lewis, date time 93. And I have to say, shout out to all the alumni from the 90s. Seem to be dominating here. Any advice on how to balance focusing on day-to-day operations versus strategic planning? It's hard to wear so many hats. Shannon, thank you, and that brings me back a little bit to my comment on the time management. The day-to-day operations is, in a way, obviously there are a number of things that have to happen, but the day-to-day problems can sometimes distract you from what is really critical. And I have no better advice than for you to be crystal clear, if possible, on what must be accomplished by when, and really try to avoid doing anything that doesn't move the ball forward on those critical points. So the strategic planning, if by strategic planning you mean thinking about the long term, you need to be guided by a long-term vision of where you're going. But fundamentally, what you have to do is figure out what the key areas of uncertainty are and how you can resolve them. For most startups, this is making sure that there is a real market need and a real customer. And then you have questions beyond that. In some cases, obviously the technology risk is high, particularly things in the life sciences, possibly some things in the world of energy. In which case, and I just had recent experience with a med device startup that I founded with a partner, where it was all about, can we make the science work? Well, in a business like that, it doesn't make any sense to worry about anything else until you've resolved that problem. In some cases, there's a key partnership or a key relationship that it needs to be nailed down before you make any progress. In fact, I'm using the case of Rent the Runway, possibly a business many of you know of, where really the critical success factor for them was, could they get the designers on their side? They knew early on they had a market need, but they didn't have a business until they could have until they had the designers buy into their model, and that was what they needed to focus on. So it's really figuring out what the key risks are and how you can resolve them, and that really should drive how you spend your time. And thank you, Shannon. Andy Kimball, Wemba 95. What are some of the unusual review methods and processes you have observed that provide the best feedback on startup performance and direction? Andy, I'm not sure that my answer is going to fully address your question, and if not, please ask me to elaborate on part of this. But one of the things that I mentioned briefly in the video, and maybe I'll repeat now, is let me just take a simple example. Sometimes I have discussions with students or fledgling entrepreneurs, and we talk about the idea of just launching the product. And I always stop them and say, before you launch, what are you trying to learn? What are you going to learn from the experiment that you are performing? There should always be a learning purpose. You might say, well, we're going to launch and see if people like our product, but it's never that simple. No product is that simple that it's just a simple yes or no answer. There are different features that you think may or may not be critical. There are things that might appeal to different audiences, and what you're trying to find is a match between sort of a bundle of capabilities or features and a target customer. So how are you going to get the right set of capabilities in the hands of the right people? So I think, I don't know if this counts as an unusual method, but I always tell people, just stop for a second and ask yourself, what is the purpose of the experiment you're performing? What are you going to learn, and what are you going to do with the answer? As I said in the video, failure by itself doesn't tell you anything. If you just throw a product out there and discover that nobody likes it, now what? That doesn't give you any direction. But if you discover that there's a particular aspect of it that you thought people would take a certain way and they've taken a different way, now perhaps you have something that you can work on, some changes that you can make. I'm falling behind here. Vijay Raghavendran, Gemba 13. In a lean startup, is there a balance between a minimum-based product launched to credibility with the consumer? So, the lean startup uses this concept of a minimal viable product, which I think is a very helpful concept. And when you think about that, as I've reflected on some of the lean startup material, that is certainly something we've tried to bring into the program for entrepreneurs. What is the minimal viable product? Well, the minimal viable product, of course, depends on who the customer is and what their specific need is. So, just to repeat myself again, it's about finding the product market match. And in order to do that, you really have to have a particular customer in mind that you're trying to serve. And you've got to work from that to understanding the need well enough that you can at least form a hypothesis about what product satisfied the core needs of that customer, and that becomes the basis for your market test or your minimal viable product. Chris Adams, Gemba 11. How important is IP for raising money today? So I'm going to read, Chris, I hope this is okay. I'm going to read your whole question here. I'm starting a health company with a doctor partner. We have 2 ideas for nutraceutical supplement products based on whole foods, which I do not believe to be patentable. One of these products is similar to a current product tested successfully in the market. Will this be a limiting factor in raising money? So what investors look for, and what you should look for in starting a company, is if I'm right about my product market match idea, will I be the one that capitalizes on that discovery, if you will? How do you do that? Well, generally, you need to be able to compete for a reasonable period of time. In many businesses, for a while in technology, but less so now, certainly in life sciences, and probably in some areas of energy, intellectual property protection has been the thing that guarantees that you have at least a fair shot at being the one that capitalizes on the business idea that you created. It's not the only basis for competing. Capturing distribution, Chris, you mentioned Whole Foods. If you have a partnership with the primary distributor of the product that you're interested in marketing, then lack of intellectual property should not be a barrier. But what I'd encourage you to do is to think about, suppose we're right and we discover something that other people don't know, which is usually what's required for a startup. What's going to prevent other people from coming in and capitalizing on this idea and keeping us from being the ones that reap the benefits? There's got to be a good answer to that question. It could be intellectual property. It could be that being first matters. It could be that you've got some unique relationships that are critical, distributors or whatever. Or it could be that you've captured a particular niche market, whether it's geographic or whatever, but it has to be something. So, so how important is IP? Well, it's one of the weapons that you might need to have in order to compete. David Payne, CC 12. Our company has 2 tough questions that keep us up at night. Who is our ideal target customer, low-hanging fruit, and what is the ideal service product mix? Do you have an opinion about which question is more important for a startup and or which we are most likely to learn from interviewing customers versus market testing? Okay, so those are two tough questions. Let me say that unless there's a customer, there's no product. So the most important question is the customer, and the customer is the anchor for answering the product question. You identify a target customer, you characterize a need as carefully as you can, as completely as you can, and then you try to match the product to it, and that's how the product market match process goes. Sometimes you have a choice in the sense of you have a hypothesis, there's a set of customers over here that may have the need, and there's a set of customers over here who may have a slightly different need, and which ones do we test first? That can be a difficult choice sometimes. Now, but let me get back to that in a second. So, which are we most likely to learn from interviewing customers versus market testing? As I think I said in the video, this understanding the market thing for a startup is a bit challenging because if there were a market, you'd probably be too late. So how do you find out? Generally, asking people is not the right approach, and there must be some form of market test. So, you know, I'd say it's a little hard for me to be specific without a little more background, but I would say quickest path to a market test for the need and customer that you think most likely to be successful is what you ought to be doing. And if you're equally balanced between choice A and choice B, maybe you can construct two different market tests just to get you off the fence and push you in one direction. But get something in the hands of people as quickly as possible is almost always the best advice. And thank you for that question. Okay. What would it take? What would it take for me to get you as an advisor for my energy startup? Well, without trying to open the floodgates here, probably the best approach would be to send me an email with a bit of a summary. I am often happy to provide some level of advice to startups. I'm occasionally happy to be an advisor to a startup, but before I do that, I really need to make sure that that I'm the right person, that I know enough, that I have enough relevant experience, and really can add something to the mix. It doesn't help either of us for you to have someone like me as an advisor if I'm not really adding value. So I'm happy to have a conversation and you know, explore what makes sense for you to have as advisor, and if it's not me, maybe point you in the right direction. Marcelo Nobrega, Wemba, 2012. How do you manage an idea that can be easily replicated by established business with more resources and a better infrastructure to test the market, to develop the idea, to go to market, and to scale? Marcelo, and the rest of you, you know, this, of course, is one of the challenges that startups often face. You know, and sometimes I work with potential entrepreneurs, and there are a couple of questions that you have to ask yourself when you have an idea. First of all, you have to ask whether, if you're right about a market need and the product that you have in mind, you should ask yourself the question of, is this a product concept or is this a company? Sometimes there's a great idea, but really it's not the basis for a company. In which case, the best thing you can do is to see if somebody will take the idea off your hands for a suitable kind of compensation. If you ask yourself the question of, is it product versus startup versus company, then you have to ask yourself, even if you think potentially it's a company idea, is it a startup? And in order to be a startup, it can't be easily picked up by the incumbents in whatever space you're in. I presume many of you are familiar with Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, etc. There's a very helpful analysis in Christensen that can help you think through whether incumbents in the space that you're planning to enter are going to respond quickly or slowly if you establish a market need. It has to do with things like what customers are they focused on versus what customers are you focused on, and what values does their business currently run on, thresholds of gross margin, size of market, etc. If you look at the incumbents that you're worried about, and if you think that you are offering a product to the customers that they are currently focused on, I think you probably have a very rough row to hoe. If you are focused on serving customers that are not really the core, but in Christensen's words, are either overserved or not served, maybe you can get started. And if you're trying to get started in a niche that's probably not significant enough for them to look at right now, maybe you have a window of opportunity. But I think the best way to answer this question of whether an incumbent is likely to come and eat your lunch before you've had a chance, go through the exercise of thinking who their core customers are, and are you serving them, and is your business really a nice incremental step from where they are right now, or is it a dramatic step from where they are right now? If you're focused on customers different from the ones they're focused on, and to do what you're doing would be a dramatic step for them, then maybe you have a window of opportunity. And thanks for that question. Chris Lamb, Wemba 97. And one pitfall many small B2B companies fall into is focusing from learning from only a few early customers. The result is they build a custom solution that does not address problems experienced by a larger market. It is easy to see because the cash from one or two big customers is very attractive. Any advice on how to serve those early customers while still learning and building a larger market? Chris, outstanding question. Not so easy to give a blanket answer to, but certainly a really important set of considerations. I'd begin by not discouraging you from focusing on solving the problems of a very specific set of customers. The more you can tie what you're doing to actual customers, the better in general your solution can be. Now, when does this work and when does it not work? It works when the early customers represent an interesting enough market. And it doesn't work when the customers you focus on are so idiosyncratic that they don't really represent a market, and you think you have something, but in fact there really isn't a market behind those early adopters. And if we're ever sitting at a bar, I'll share an experience that I've had where, in fact, while you were doing your Wemba program, where we did a great job serving a few customers in a data networking company, and the market wasn't behind them, and we kind of ran out of steam because the rest of the market wasn't there. So how do you avoid doing that? Well, while I won't, I'm going to stick to my advice that you focus on serving a few customers. You need to have the question in the back of your mind, do these customers really represent a market, or are they so far ahead of the curve that there really is no market behind them? So you need to do, the only thing you can do is do a little bit of work and really assess realistically, frankly, whether the rest of the market is there. Again, speaking from my own experience, again, a data networking company that we thought we were going to sell to a lot of large telephone companies. And I, as a VP marketing and then CEO of this company, spent hours and hours and hours at a lot of big companies. And if I'd been more realistic, I would have realized that these companies were many, many years away from adopting the technology we were pushing, as opposed to they're always interested in listening, but they weren't really going to buy. So some amount of time invested in really assessing whether your early customers are really early adopters in a big market, which is going to happen in a reasonable period of time, or, not to use the term pejoratively, sort of the lunatic fringe, that are so far ahead of the curve that there is no market behind them. Investing a little bit of time in answering that question is probably time well spent. And I don't know, I wish I knew a simple formula for doing that, but it just takes a little bit of time to assess the other potential customers that you're hypothesizing represent the rest of the market. There's a question from Tommy. Lean startup is most often discussed in the context of tech startups and clearly is a methodology that works well in that space. What thoughts can you share on how this process of experimentation can be effectively applied in a slower moving industry, such as consumer packaged goods? Similarly, which aspects of the approach are not so applicable in these more traditional verticals? Tommy, thanks for that question. So if you read the Lean Startup work, it's explicitly designed for tech startups, the world of apps and websites. In fact, really it's for those of you that have a software background will recognize it's really the application of agile development and the extreme programming and things like that that were popularized in the software industry in the 90s to the whole concept of a startup. That is, rather than build a big system and go through a complex test scenario, you build incrementally small things, test as you go, and test and do a market test, ideally, as you go as well. I said a couple of minutes ago that my orientation is not so much with a recipe that applies in a small space, potentially, but in the underlying logic. And if you look at the Duke Venn site, in particular the guidelines for financing and the concept of milestone planning, the methodology of building a roadmap based on assessing risk and uncertainty, thinking about a way to learn intelligently and efficiently, I think applies to every industry. But how you apply it obviously depends a great deal on the specifics of the industry that you're in. So for example, if, just hypothetically, if you're interested in introducing a new candy product to the market, the sooner you can perform a market test, the sooner you can get direct feedback, the better off you are. What will you learn? You'll learn whether somebody likes it, and ideally you'll learn who likes it. And if they like it, when would they want to consume it, and when would they buy it, and how would they buy it? And these are all things that are critical in a startup for success, and they are all things that are probably best learned through a process of experimentation. And in fact, just like a tech startup in today's software world, these things can be learned, I think, quite easily and inexpensively in some consumer products, like hypothetically a candy business. And thank you for that question, Tommy. Arturo Fagundo, Wemba 2012. The lean startup process rightly emphasizes the need for early customer validation of your idea. How much validation? Arturo, thank you for that question, and I hope things are going well for you. This is why it's hard to reduce these principles to a recipe. How much validation indeed? So let me just step back and put myself in the position of an investor And suppose you're in a business that is trying to sell software to the enterprise. How much validation would I need to see before I would put early money in? Well, I'd want to know that there were a couple of customers who were, this is different from the sort of the consumer-facing tech world where the software investment is more significant, the customer's investment is more significant, and so the adoption process is going to be slower. I'd want to see real commitment from 2 or 3 customers, and then back to the question we had earlier, I'd want to see I'd want to have some confidence that the early customers actually represented a market. So I'd want to see some customer development from a broader customer base that gave me some confidence that success with the early adopters was going to translate into success in a broader market. So, Arturo, you asked me the specific question about how much validation. So, in a hypothetical case that you're trying to sell enterprise software, I personally would want to see, call it real serious validation. The adoption cycle started at, let's call it 3 customers, and then maybe half a dozen more customers that I thought there was a real credible chance that they would adopt this technology. And so I've given you a very specific answer, but if you've got a website addressed at college kids, how much validation would I want to see? Obviously the answer would be completely different. So it really is specific to the situation and to the tastes, the experience, confidence level of the person doing the evaluation. And so in your case, I would throw it back to you. How much validation do you think objectively gives you the confidence that you need to invest yourself in this business? And thanks for that question. Oh, I'm going to have to speed up here. Pamela Meek, Daytime 94. Given the aging baby boomers, and I have no idea who you're talking about, do you find that older individuals are thriving as entrepreneurs, or do we lose our risk appetites? I'm not sure whether to take that personally or not, but I think the data shows in general that successful entrepreneurs are by and large people in their late 30s, early 40s who've had reasonably successful careers, have a foundation, and then have gone off to start a business based on a pretty rational, critical evaluation of that. In my case, I'm not going to make any claims to success, but my career sort of followed a trajectory like that. And speaking personally, there came a point where I asked myself, well, if some of you have been in this position, you realize that being the CEO of a startup is a very consuming occupation. It's very hard to get away from it. And it's not so much the risk, because as I think about it, what's the risk? If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But if you've learned and followed something that you thought was worthwhile, I think in most cases people don't hurt their careers by pursuing a rational entrepreneurial path. If you do something flaky, it's hard to explain to people, but I'm not quite sure what the risk is. But as baby boomers age, do you want to commit that amount of time and energy to a startup? There's a point in your life where it becomes more difficult. So I guess I do think that there may be a time where you age out of this process, but I think it's not so much about the risk. But thanks for that question, Pamela. And being a daytime 94, I don't think you're in that category. Joe Bynum, daytime 93. With a capital-intensive idea, prototype built, how would you stage your funding effort? So, I've kind of, Joe, thanks for that. I've given some thoughts on this. I'd encourage you to take a look at the milestone planning exercise that I outlined in the Duke Venn website. One way you can think about the roadmap for learning is, what are the steps that cause the value of your venture to increase? The step-ups in valuation always track to significant reductions in the risk. And so if you do a good job of mapping the primary areas of uncertainty, the primary areas of risk, and take significant risk off the table, you have caused a corresponding increase in the valuation. I suggest that the right way to think about funding a venture is to fund the major milestones that cause a step up in valuation. And to the extent that you can build that roadmap, you can build a financing plan that uses capital most efficiently, preserves the most equity for the founders. And I think that's the right way to go about things. So, as I said earlier, that's kind of the logic, but how you apply it to your specific business depends on a lot of experience and a lot of judgment. And I'd encourage you to get some people around the table and really think through that roadmap seriously and use that as the foundation of your financing plan. And thanks for that. Ping Benyakam, and I sincerely ask your forgiveness if I have not pronounced your name correctly, daytime 2011. What is your advice for a startup in an industry where there are few but powerful competitors? How to break the oligopoly? Well, I would suggest that you begin by not trying to break an oligopoly. If you are facing well-established, well-resourced competitors and trying to take them head on, you are probably in trouble. The best thing to do is to find some place where they are not focused and get established there. And almost always that means find some customer set that they are not serving or not serving appropriately. Generally, those opportunities are found, if you will, at the low end of the market, where the incumbents are focused on the sort of more advanced users. Sometimes you can find a niche at, quote unquote, the low end, or find some other niche and get established there. I think that's the only rational advice I'd give you on that question. Okay, Rama, well, unfortunately, I'm going to butcher this name because I can't quite read it, but I'm going to try Muthavu? Anyway, forgive me if I got that wrong, but daytime 2011. The term pivot is a catchphrase in the startup world. How do you define a true pivot and when to pivot? So, a pivot, and this is part of the marketing of this lean startup idea, is when you change your plan based on learning. A true pivot, well, I think that it's a nifty word, and using it is sort of shows that you're kind of in, and you get this, the new terminology. But the basic concept's not that complicated. If you have a learning objective in an experiment, that should come with sort of a decision that if it goes this way, I'm going to take this step, and if it goes this other way, I'm going to take this other step. And it's that choice as the result of what you learned in an experiment that is a pivot. Sometimes what happens is instead of having an explicit learning experience, you just try something, it doesn't work, and now you go back to the drawing board and try to invent something else. When you invent something else, that's described as a pivot. That can work, and sometimes, that's the reality. But I think of a pivot as simply making a decision based on something you've learned. And it's generally taking one or another of a choice that you've teed up in advance, or sort of doing a reset and trying something else. I wouldn't get too caught up in the term, but I would really focus on the idea of what am I trying to learn and what am I going to do with the information, and give yourself as much flexibility as possible and give yourself the maximum chance of success. And I think we're about out of time. I really want to thank everybody for taking part in this. Once we got going, I thought there were great questions coming at me about as fast as I could handle them. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance. This has been a great deal of fun. I'm going to encourage you again to, if you haven't already done so, get on the Duke Gen website, sign up, become part of the Duke entrepreneurial community, be an active participant, go to the events, and network with your peers and colleagues. And we're working hard to make the Duke entrepreneurship community successful and a vibrant community for alumni, students, faculty, and everybody. And I really want to encourage everybody to be part of that. And the last thing I get to do is to ask you to participate in the next of these sessions, where the presenter will be my colleague David Ridley, who is the faculty director of the Health Sector Management Program. Very bright and interesting young health economist that we're very lucky to have at Fuqua. And I should also say that he is the Dr. and Mrs. Frank A. Riddick Associate Professor of the Practice of Business and Economics. But you can trust me, he's a very smart young guy and very interesting, and I hope you will participate in his session as well. And let me thank you again for participating, and I wish all of you happy holidays. Take care. Bye.